She was 84 years old. She lived quietly. She posed no threat to anyone. And yet, one night, she simply vanished. No forced entry. No signs of struggle. No goodbye. Just silence where a person used to be. But here is what made this case different from every other disappearance you have ever heard about. The answer was not hidden somewhere far away. It was not buried under years of mystery. It was sitting right there, captured in fragments on ordinary neighborhood cameras, waiting for someone to look at it again through the right lens. And when one person finally stepped forward and said a single name out loud, everything that investigators thought they understood about that night suddenly looked completely different. Not because the evidence changed, but because the person who spoke that name was the last person anyone expected to break the silence. Nancy Guthrie was not the kind of person whose name was supposed to end up in a criminal investigation. She was 84 years old, living in the Catalina Foothills, one of Tucson's most established and quiet neighborhoods. A woman of her age, with limited physical mobility, had built her life in that home over decades. Her routines were simple. Her world was small. And the people around her were not strangers. They were family. That is what made the night she disappeared so deeply unsettling. Because when investigators arrived and began piecing together what had happened, there was no obvious chaos to explain it. No broken locks. No shattered furniture. No alarm that had been triggered. The home looked almost exactly as it always did, except Nancy was gone. Her phone was still inside the house. Her personal belongings remained exactly where she had left them. For a woman who could not simply walk away on her own, the scene made no sense. And in cases that make no sense, investigators know one thing almost immediately. The answer is almost never found far from home. For weeks, the investigation moved carefully. Statements were taken. Footage was reviewed. Tips came in from across the city, many of them later found to have no connection to Nancy's disappearance at all. False leads consumed time. Public attention drifted toward speculation. And inside the family, something that is common in cases like this began to happen. People stayed quiet. Emotions were guarded. Words were chosen carefully. Relatives protected each other, or at least appeared to, while investigators worked through incomplete information trying to assemble a picture without knowing what they were building. And then everything shifted. Nancy's own son stood up and said a name publicly. Not behind closed doors. Not in a private statement shared only with detectives. He said it where everyone could hear it. He named Tommaso Cion. His own brother-in-law. The husband of his sister. A man who was not a stranger to the family but one of its own members. And the moment that name entered the public space, the entire gravity of the investigation began to move in a different direction. Not because a public accusation is evidence. It is not. Not because naming someone proves anything. It does not. But because when a person inside the family breaks the silence and points towards someone specific, every single detail investigators had already collected suddenly carries a different weight. The surveillance footage looked different. The timeline looked different. The gaps looked different. And the questions that had been sitting unanswered in case files suddenly had a face attached to them. To understand why this moment mattered so much, you have to understand what the cameras did and did not capture that night. Several residential security cameras in the neighborhood near the property were active during the critical window. These were not professional systems. They were ordinary consumer devices, doorbell cameras, driveway units, side-mounted home security cameras installed by neighbors to watch their own properties. None of them were synchronized. None of them were designed to work together as a network. Each one pointed in a different direction, recorded at different quality levels, and covered only a limited portion of the street and surrounding area. What they appear to show collectively is movement. Not at the front entrance. Not in a clear, unobstructed view. But near the side of the home, at the very outer edge of what those cameras could see. Investigators say that zone is crucial. It was a place where a person or a vehicle could remain partially hidden, visible only in fragments, only in shadows, only for a few frames at a time before the angle shifted and the moment was gone. During the first review of this footage, detectives were working under enormous pressure. They were dealing with massive volumes of video, inconsistent timestamps across multiple devices, and the urgent need to find something obvious. A face. A license plate. A clean entry or exit they could build a timeline around. When none of those things appeared immediately, much of the footage was reportedly labeled inconclusive and set aside. But here is what inconclusive does not mean. It does not mean empty. And that distinction may be the most important detail in this entire case. Because when investigators went back and reviewed that same footage frame by frame, the movement near the side of the house became clearer than it had during the first pass. And when they cross-referenced the timestamps from multiple cameras, that movement fell directly inside a gap in Tommaso's known timeline. Not near it. Not close to it. Inside it. That information may have been sitting in those files from the very beginning. But without a specific direction to look, it was only unexplained movement near a house during an important hour. It could have meant anything. After Nancy's son said the name, investigators may have begun to see it as something else entirely. Tommaso Cion was not a stranger to Nancy Guthrie. He was her son-in-law, married to her daughter, and by that relationship alone, he was someone who would have had regular access to the home. He would have known the layout. He would have known the routines. He would have known which entrance was used most often, where things were kept, and how the household moved through an ordinary day. Investigators say that kind of familiarity matters enormously in cases like this. Because it answers one of the first questions that comes up when an elderly woman disappears without signs of forced entry. How did someone get inside without causing immediate alarm? Nancy, at 84, with limited mobility, living in what she believed was the safety of her own home, would have had no reason to fear someone she already knew and trusted. She would have opened the door. She would not have seen danger in the first moments. She would not have had time to feel afraid before the situation changed. That is the theory Nancy's son appears to be pointing toward. Not a masked intruder. Not a stranger forcing entry in the dark. But someone expected. Someone familiar. Someone whose arrival that night might have looked completely normal from the outside. And here is where the timeline problem becomes impossible to ignore. Tommaso's account of where he was during the critical hours does not fully align with what the reanalyzed camera footage now appears to show. This is not a dramatic contradiction. He did not claim to be in another city while cameras placed him at the scene. The issue is far more subtle, and in investigations, subtle gaps are often far more dangerous than obvious ones. There is a narrow window of time where his stated movements do not cleanly explain the activity captured near the site of the property. A gap. And that gap now sits at the center of everything. Investigators are examining what Nancy's son did when he spoke that name publicly was not a small thing. Tommaso is married to his sister. That means the moment he said the name out loud, he did not just influence the direction of a criminal investigation. He placed a fracture inside his own family that cannot easily be repaired. Investigators who work family-centered cases know this pattern well. In the early stages, relatives stay close. They protect each other. They speak carefully and avoid saying anything that could damage someone they love, even when something is sitting heavy inside them. But sometimes that silence becomes unbearable. Sometimes what a person knows, or believes, or has come to fear, grows too large to stay contained. And when it breaks in a way that cannot be taken back. Nancy's son reached that point. Whatever he knew, or believed, or had come to feel certain about, it was enough to make public confrontation feel less costly than continued silence. People do not usually risk destroying family relationships unless the weight of staying quiet has become worse than the weight of speaking. Investigators are now trying to understand exactly what pushed him to that threshold. What did he see? What did he hear? What did he come to know that made naming his own brother-in-law feel not just necessary, but unavoidable? On the surface, Nancy Guthrie does not appear to be someone surrounded by obvious motives for violence. She was elderly. She lived quietly. She was not at the center of any public conflict. But investigators who work disappearances involving family members know that what looks calm from the outside can carry enormous pressure underneath. Nancy lived in the Catalina Foothills, one of Tucson's more valuable areas. A longtime homeowner with decades of built assets can become the center of a very complicated financial picture involving estates, inheritance expectations, and the quiet tensions that build when family members begin thinking about what comes next. These realities do not prove wrongdoing. But detectives routinely examine them in cases where an elderly person vanishes from home without signs of random crime. Who could benefit? Who understood the financial structure? Who had trusted access to the property without causing alarm? Tommaso Cion, as Nancy's son-in-law, naturally falls within the circle of people investigators would study under every one of those categories. Investigators would want to know the real nature of his relationship with Nancy. How often was he at the house? Were there tensions over care, property, or future plans? Were there legal or financial matters that connected him to her affairs? These are standard questions in any family-centered investigation. But after Nancy's son publicly named Tommaso, those same questions now carry a weight they did not carry before. There is one detail that investigators say they cannot move past. The cameras were active that night. They captured movement. And then, at the moment that mattered most, the footage ends. The angle shifts. The sequence breaks before the defining moment is ever recorded. Whether that happened because of a technical failure, a timed-out motion sensor, a full storage drive, or a weak wireless signal, no one has confirmed publicly. But the other possibility is one the family cannot stop thinking about. Someone who knew exactly how those home security systems worked may have known precisely when and where to move to avoid being clearly captured. Cutting power, disrupting a signal, or staying just outside a sensor's trigger zone does not require advanced knowledge. But doing it successfully, at exactly the right moment, suggests planning. It suggests someone who arrived already thinking about what would be seen and what would not. And no vehicle has been clearly captured arriving or departing during the critical hours. For a woman with limited mobility who could not have left that property on foot, transportation would almost certainly have been required. That missing vehicle remains one of the largest unanswered questions in the case. Nancy Guthrie has not been found. Tommaso Cion has not been charged. None of what investigators believe has been confirmed in a courtroom, and none of this is a concluded account. But something has changed in this case that cannot be unchanged. A man inside the family heard his own name spoken publicly by someone who had every reason to stay silent and every personal cost attached to speaking. And Nancy's son said it anyway. He knew what it would do to his sister's marriage. He knew what it would do to the family. He said it anyway. The question that now sits at the center of everything is not just what the cameras captured or what the timeline shows. The question is what Nancy's son knows that made that moment, with all of its cost, feel worth it. Because people do not break that kind of silence without a reason. And somewhere inside that reason may be the closest thing to an answer this case has produced so far.